All right. Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming. Hope you're enjoying your time here in Orlando. We have a very intriguing panel coming up on ISO 20022. Just this past month in April, we actually had several RTGS migrations to ISO 20022, one being CHIPS. We actually have the clearinghouse here today. We then had Hong Kong chats a couple weeks later. So we have a lot of local schemes migrating now while we're in our coexistence period for ISO, which will end next year in 2025. So today we'll talk about a couple different things. We'll talk about the migrations, the successes that we've had, the key learnings across each of the banks. We'll talk about what's next after we implement ISO 22. What does this actually mean for our clients? What does this mean for our banks? And we'll get into the nitty-gritty there. So before I get started, I'll have each of the panelists kind of introduce themselves and give a brief bio. So we'll start with you.
Richard Zena from the Clearinghouse with responsibility for core products, canvassing CHIPS, which is our high value service, EPN, our ACH product, and SVPCO, our check image business line. Our focus today, of course, is CHIPS.
Raghu Srinivasan, Global Head of the FI Clearing at Bank of America. Been with the bank 20 years, did the rotation through audit, risk, compliance, and glad to be here.
Hi, I'm Ken Wong from TD, based up in Toronto. I'm part of the product team in the GTB. I look after product strategy innovation. I'm also the co-chair of the BAF Payments Committee. And as was mentioned just now, BAF is writing 3 papers on ISO. The first one was published, Lessons Learned. The second one that's coming out pretty soon, I hope, because I'm trying to put it together, is about best practices. And the third one that we're going to start up in the fall is about sanctions and compliance and how ISO can help.
Great. And I think I already mentioned my name is Alexa Dushel. I'm with HSBC, their U.S. Head of Strategic Payment Initiatives. I also wear a global hat for the cross-border, cross-currency value stream from an operations perspective. So let's get started. Richard, I'd like to ask you about the CHIPS migration that happened exactly a month ago today. Can you tell us kind of how it went, some key learnings, metrics, things like that?
Well, my pleasure. And as noted, today marks precisely the 1-month anniversary of CHIPS production operations on the ISO message format. Many of us in this room labored in support of this interest for the better part of a decade. So this achievement represents a singular milestone for the US payments industry and for the dollar from a policy perspective as a reserve and global settlement currency. I'm pleased to share a few insights with respect to our production experience to date, and also a few lessons learned from our implementation and our program. With respect to the initial weeks of operation on CHIPS ISO, by almost any measure, our experience can be qualified as an unequivocal success. CHIPS has functioned smoothly from open to close on each business day without identification of any material issues. Participants generally are reporting straight-through processing rates on par with, or in some cases exceeding that of CHIPS legacy. Of course, we are aware of some circumstances in which participants continue to work through process refinements in the bank-to-bank message flow, but the participant experience so far has been very favorable. With respect to our performance metrics, liquidity ratios, coverage metrics, straight-through processing rates, we are reporting at or better than CHIPS legacy across all of our risk tolerance metrics. And we recently concluded our period of heightened operational vigilance with respect to the platform and are essentially back to business as usual in terms of the CHIPS production operating environment. So far as volume is concerned, we are absolutely aware that in support of the implementation, many participants throttled activity between the Fedwire Fund Service and CHIPS, prudently so from a risk management perspective. I will note that volume was very tepid on the open of April 8th, but it was a joy to behold the collective epiphany when participants realized that messages were flowing across the platform smoothly, and then the floodgates opened. There was no better expression of confidence in the performance of CHIPS ISO over the implementation period than in that precise moment. On day one, we ended up processing over 550,000 transfers with a value of 1.8 trillion, very consistent with a conventional operating day. Our volumes have subsequently returned to historical baseline. Indeed, for the month of April of 2024, we are plus 2.6% in volume relative to April of 2023, a pretty significant accomplishment given the implementation of CHIPS ISO during that month. Also, and I think quite positively, we've received reports from our SWIFT colleagues that the volume of native ISO cross-border traffic on the SWIFT platform has increased by about 10% since the implementation of CHIPS ISO and the addition of the indispensable dollar leg in the cross-border payments chain. So all very, very favorable in terms of our production experience. So far as lessons learned to date, I think these can broadly be categorized maybe in two themes. One, maybe traditional program management, best practice, and some ISO-specific lessons learned. In the former would be things like establish an enterprise-wide program plan, an enterprise-wide governance, embrace governance review and challenge, engage with vendors early and often, over-communicate to all stakeholders, participants, governance, and supervisors, and the like. And all of those features of the program absolutely indispensable to our collective success. But let me, spend most of my time on what I will suggest are ISO-specific lessons learned. One would be to schedule frequent and robust dress rehearsals. Now, many of these experiences that I share with respect to ISO-specific lessons learned are gleaned from the experiences of other jurisdictions that preceded us, and we are the beneficiary of being on the receiving end of the insights from other jurisdictions in the global ISO choreography, and also lessons learned from some of our major banks that, of course, went through ISO migrations in other markets. So first, frequent and robust dress rehearsals. We actually had 8 dress rehearsals supporting the CHIPS ISO implementation, far in excess than the number that were in place for other jurisdictions. We had 4 volitional dress rehearsals in Q4 of 2023, 4 mandatory dress rehearsals in Q1 2024. All of them had particular subjects and focuses, such as performance testing, such as failover testing and BRT testing to confirm our ability to rotate across some of our production sites. But most of all, they all underscored 2 primary features. One, the ability of the clearinghouse to establish its pre-production CHIPS ISO environment, which became production on go live. And second, from a participant perspective, to confirm the ability of participants to exchange CHIPS ISO formatted messages across the network. When we ultimately went live on April 8th, effectively it was like dress rehearsal 9, but we never looked back. A second very significant lesson learned was from an infrastructure perspective, taking the readiness of CHIPS participants as seriously as we took our readiness as an operator. And I will suggest that given the systemic nature of CHIPS, we had an affirmative obligation to confirm the readiness of the community with respect to this significant milestone beyond our own clearinghouse readiness as operator. So our entire program, was structured across two dimensions, one being clearinghouse milestones and two being participant readiness. I will suggest that the most important anchor of that latter element, participant readiness, was a very robust attestation process that we embedded within our program that went far beyond conventional software certification to include upstream and downstream applications and interfaces far beyond the visibility of the clearinghouse as operator. We published this attestation statement over a year in advance because we wanted all participants to understand precisely the rigorous standard that we would be holding them to prior to go live. We also resisted all appeals to caveat select elements of the attestation statement prior to go live. We knew that we wanted the rigor of a very high standard associated with that attestation and quality submissions, even before timely submissions. So we had select attestations that really came in right at the 11th hour prior to go live on April 8th. We also knew that the attestation process would engender confidence across the community with respect to the standards that all would be held to, and a confidence in individual participants, therefore in the readiness of their peers. And this was a very, very important element of the process. We also required signatures from both a senior business representative and a senior technology representative, and also included features of the attestation that required engagement across the entire enterprise to include second-line risk management and third-line auditors. It was a very robust process, and I think very critical, even indispensable to the collective success of our migration. A third theme might be to establish very robust go-live criteria and an accompanying go-live methodology to support final decision-making. So we established criteria across technology, operations, participant readiness, and other factors. And then we measured against those criteria throughout the process. Some were hard-line go, no-go criteria against which we knew we could not proceed confidently if we were not above the bar. So some of those elements include things like no critical and high defects in the CHIPS ISO core, a substantial quorum of participants that have qualified for readiness, and given the liquidity nature, the liquidity savings nature and the algorithm of the CHIPS platform, for it to function, we needed a critical mass of volume and value qualified for Go on the network, and that was a hard criteria. We probably had 40 or so criteria across those dimensions, and having that standard ex ante prior to go live was very, very important. And then we had a very rigorous and robust methodology associated with that decision making, starting with our internal steering group, proceeding through the CHIPS Business Committee, the Executive Risk Management Committee of the Clearinghouse, the Enterprise Risk Committee of the PAYCO Board of Governance, the PAYCO Board itself, T-minus 2 days through the Executive Risk Management Committee again, T-minus 1 day on Saturday, April the 7th, again with the Executive Risk Management Committee to confirm that the implementation had gone well. It was an absolute gauntlet, a very high standard. It was not fun, but it was absolutely necessary given the systemic nature of CHIPS as a high-value payment system and really an anchor on which the US economy and the financial system depend. There is no higher accolade for a financial market infrastructure than to have a systemic implementation be described as boring. Now, there was nothing boring about the CHIPS implementation for the clearinghouse or the wire operation rooms of our participant banks. But from the perspective of the outside world, April 8th, 2024 was just another day. Now, I know implementation of ISO is not an end to itself. It is a means to an end, an aspiration to deliver value across the payments chain. Now, we as an infrastructure operator believe very strongly that one of our first responsibilities is to establish the infrastructure around which the private sector can innovate and deliver value for our customers. So I'm going to stop talking and start listening to my colleagues to the left, because they're going to educate all of us, including me. So thank you.
Thanks
Sorry
so much.
about that.
No worries. I was not bored. Raghu, if you could just touch on your ISO implementation really quick, and then we'll get into the fun stuff.
Of course. Needless to say, first, thank you to you, Richard, and your team behind the scenes, Bob Pepitone, Ed. You guys, your collaboration and your help was tremendous. I also see Pat in the audience from Swift. The Swift team did fabulous work as well to get us ready through the CBPR Plus migration. So the industry-wide collaboration among the banks, among the participants, has been spectacular to help us get here. Mm-hmm. On a very pragmatic level, when you talk about lessons learned, we banks, we had a shortcut. Richard alluded to that. If we had a challenge on a transaction going through chips, we were able to quickly put a routing rule and move that transaction to Fedwire. Basically, we took an easy way out rather than thinking in terms of what is the underlying quality of the data that is needed to be improved so that we can continue processing those transactions through chips. So in addition to the internal lessons learned on project management, clarity on the business requirements, it's a typical to any major project that any banks execute, any entity executes. So you have the lessons learned from the project management side. But the bigger aspect that we need to focus is, did we truly migrate to ISO 20022, or did we just change the format of the data, taking a garbage in one format and putting the same garbage in the other? And the reckoning is going to be right around the corner if we don't make the fundamental changes within our institutions and help other banks also who is going to be getting into this journey of ISO 20022 for the Fed migration early next year.
Right.
How many banks we are talking about? We are talking about CHIPS migration of 40 or so banks.
41. But
when you talk about Fedwire migration, now the count explodes.
Right.
So forums like this and participants from all of our institutions, we need to make sure that we are focusing on helping our customers truly originate richer data, helping the other banks who have not been part of the ISO journey to get there through the Fedwire migration.
Great.
You want to go to the next question? I can do that. Okay, so my take on this is basically, and I'm just going to go forward, she doesn't have to ask the question, is unfortunately banks have taken this whole ISO migration implementation as a necessary compliance or regulatory burden. And I think they haven't actually looked at it from an end-to-end perspective. The question is, why are we doing ISO? What we've done so far is really the bank-to-bank stuff, and we have forgotten about the client, all right? So from the bank-to-bank perspective, yeah, we'll take the message in. The benefits of that, and if you actually go full for, structured and everything, is the potential of making the payment go faster, more STP, because in a structured format, I will know the sequence of letters might say Iran or something like that, which a sanctions filter might catch. But then if you know it's in a certain field and it doesn't actually mean Iran, the country, it's good to go, instead of someone stopping in and looking for it. Or information that you need. Sometimes in some countries, you need passport numbers, you need birth dates, phone numbers, whatnot. You don't have to do an RFI. So you can actually get the data, speed it up, If you speed that up, that means the payment travels faster, which is also good for your client. But from an ROI perspective, that is still not good enough. We haven't thought about it end to end. Why are we all doing ISO? Why has ISO has been around for decades right now? Why only now? Because our clients need the data, right? How do they do the ARAP today? Especially in the MT world, where you have 140 characters. I send the payment through, I either PDF a file, send a CSV file, send an Excel file, either through some store and forward or directly to my beneficiary. And then they say, oh, the payment's come in, I need to find that file somewhere around, grab it. If it's a PDF, because a lot of people do that, they send the paper piece through. The AER side has to rekey in everything to put it up to date, the ERP systems to reconcile. That takes a lot of time, and it costs a lot of money to do. So why ISO? ISO gives us the ability to send all the data end to end with the payment so that when the client says, oh, I get my account statement, this money is for this file because everything is referenced. And if the data is actually structured in a manner that everyone understands, I just upload it to my ERP system directly. I automate everything. So for the client, that could be a significant cost savings from an operational perspective. I think when I was at another bank, this is about 30 years ago now, we did a bit of an analysis of one of our huge clients from an AP perspective. When they send a payment out, by the time it gets to the other end, they get inquiries back, oh, what was this payment for? Can you give me this detail, that detail? Goes back and forth. A corporate cost was $80 US. This is 30 years ago to make one payment. So this could significantly reduce the cost. But more importantly, if you take both parts, the bank-to-bank part, shortening the life cycle of the payment itself so it moves faster, I can reconcile my ARAP much quicker. What does that mean from an economy perspective? The supply chain goes faster. I've reconciled it. Instead of 10 days to reconcile, I reconciled in 1 day. I could ship my goods if it's pay before I send. Or I can release my credit lines from my clients so that I can do something else with it. So ISO has to be looked at not from a bank-to-bank perspective, oh, I need to do it, but we have to think of it from an end-to-end perspective, client to client, especially from the B2B side, even the C2B side. I think consumer to consumer, not so much, but it's definitely really, really important for the corporates.
Yeah, and Ken, I see a question on the screen. They're asking, how far out do you think we are from realizing the true benefits of ISO?
Now they're jumping to the very last question now. Okay. So let's talk about that right now. And I think a few sessions, even from day one, we talked a little bit about this too. What, I guess, from a psyche perspective, all banks, FMIs have to say, number one, let's standardize as much as we can. Because if you look at every single country right now, yes, they're putting ISO, it's a little bit different. So the analogy I go back and I think about is, and people have used this a long time ago, containers, shipping. Many years ago, shipping everyone, there was no standardized container size. And therefore, no one knew how to actually pack the ships. Because one package is this size, another package is that size. When we got the container ships, we could actually be very organized and ships had to be built a certain way, which makes things cheaper. People understood, but containers are not all the same size. They have a standard, but they're not all the same size. So that's what's going to happen in the whole world to do. But because it's a standard, which I've always been advocating, that the base standard has to be CBPR+, and then MIs can add on top of that, but the base structure has to be CBPR+. Standardization is the first part. The second part then is adoption. Adoption has to be across. I would say even from a global perspective. But even, let's just start in one country first, the US or even Canada. It requires everyone to adopt it in a uniform manner and quickly before we can actually realize the full benefits. Because all it takes, especially in the US, is really, really difficult because you have so many banks. If 20% of the banks say, I will not give my data to my client because it's too hard to build, yes, from a bank-to-bank perspective, I am ISO, then the benefits to the corporates won't be realized because for that 20%, they still say, I have to send it another way. I will still have all that back and forth. Then on a global basis, if every country doesn't adopt ISO in a unified manner, that means when I send things out, there's potential the data will not get there. I can't take away my old processes. All right? So I think if everyone takes a conscious effort to actually implement it to the fullest extent it can, not just from an MVP1 perspective, but think about the client, we could get there in a few years. All right? On day one, the devil advocate asked a question about interoperability, but yes, it was about digital currencies and whatnot. But that philosophy comes here too, to say interoperability is like how that person said, how do we get interoperability? It is through mandates. So some countries like Canada, to accelerate the use of ISO from an end-to-end perspective so that banks and corporates can realize the benefits quicker. We have what we call Rule 16 in the links system where it says, a bank receiving rich data must make it available to your client by the end of the day. So to get the full value, unfortunately, I would say governments and the FMIs probably have to do some mandating. Otherwise, unfortunately, we might never realize the full benefit of ISO.
Yep. You spoke a little bit about standardization and how it's really important to follow the CBPR Plus specs. How do we mitigate certain market infrastructures from creating their own types of specs? Yeah, we saw that with chips. We had some fallout where CBPR Plus would accept something, but chips wouldn't, and vice versa.
Yeah, I guess, and that's where, you know, it was said that listen to us now from a bank and from industry perspective. What do we need to do? All right, and grow with that. I think that's the only way to do it. So HVPL Plus is never 100% the same as CBPR Plus, but HVPS Plus, in my opinion, should be CBPR Plus as a base data standard, plus other things that's required for the actual, I guess, FMI itself. So as an example, in Canada again, we've kind of made a conscious decision that regardless of which system, whether it's links, whether it's going to be the new real-time rail, CBPR Plus will be our base standard. But we have built more data for each individual payment rail itself. But from what the client doesn't care about all the additional data, right? The additional data is actually for the bank-to-bank side because, for example, in links, we can prioritize payments, put it in different queues as I send it into the link systems. The client doesn't care about that. What the client cares about is the underlying data for reconciliation. So even in chips, if the underlying data for reconciliation for the ARAP perspective, it's all the same based on CBPR Plus, it works perfect. Honestly, don't really care about the rest.
I will observe that in international circles, there is some very meaningful work underway to help promote harmonization in the global choreography. And I think there's a broad recognition that if over time we devolve to idiosyncratic implementations of ISO in individual jurisdictions, then the value proposition with respect to standardization that we have worked to achieve will ultimately be lost. And all of this hard work will end up going for naught. So this is a very important subject that you've highlighted, Alexa. And I will observe from our experience, reflecting upon your observation, that there were probably a couple of instances in which we could have been more clear and specific in our own message usage guideline, because there were some examples in which participants were both consistent with the broader guideline, and yet there was still some challenge in the bank-to-bank message flow. And I will just underscore again, the value of the buddy bank testing preceding implementation, breaking down groups of our population in pods, making sure that the end-to-end from bank to bank was as smooth as possible. Those banks that really invested in that buddy bank testing gleaned the reward on a clean implementation, relative to those that did not invest so heavily in that process.
Definitely. All right, I'll turn to one of the Q&A questions. Bragu, maybe you can answer this one. What are the components of ISO that you expect will drive the most client value?
If you think about, for example, Financial Action Task Force, 16 recommendations that are coming out, they are the expectation for a better quality of originator and the beneficiary data to be in the transaction. Not only for the transparency of all the financial institutions involved, but also it is going to facilitate much smoother, efficient processing of the transaction. So we got to go back to one of the questions that Nick asked as he was wrapping up the AA session is, what is in it for the sales team? What is in it for the product team? If we can't get a good message to the sales team and product team, and if we solely focus on the compliance, reduction of friction in the compliance, the adoption is going to take longer than us able to provide very tangible benefits that the clients like. Therefore, the sales team likes to pitch that to the clients more, and the product team in turn, who is looking at the revenue aspects of it, is coming up with newer functionality. So we need to make sure that value is communicated. One of the key benefits that you're going to get is, Ken touched on the interoperability between various systems. But I think if we put it in a much more pragmatic setting, there are a lot of experiments going on within the industry for centralized sanction screening and centralized AML and so on and so forth. In the past, the regulatory interest or the regulatory nod to continue those experiments were very, very low. But now, it is much better. They are allowing more experiments to happen. They are not fully signed off on it because they are still going to hold each of the banks and each of the parties accountable for our own risk-based decision. But they are allowing these experiments to continue. Why? Because now they are looking at a consistency of the data standards at the bare minimum. They are looking at consistency of the data standards as in not all the way to the full benefits that ISO can yield in the reconciliation and the other aspects, but very pragmatic approach on, do I know the parties of the transactions involved? Do I know what are the banks involved in the transactions? So Nick, to answer the question that you asked on the AA section, on the ISO side, the margins should improve very, very quickly. The cost of compliance that all of us face is very high, and I don't believe anyone is talking about cost of compliance as a competitive advantage for our industry. Everybody thinks of it as a pain. So if you centralize some of those aspects through the interoperability benefits that the ISO brings in, we should be able to extract billions of dollars of saving, but at the same time, improving the compliance with any global regulations that are in there. And it is going to help the banks communicate much, much easier on, the AA panel touched on the trade documentation, exchange of information. The same thing applies on the payment side. Any documentation, any reconciliation means that needs to be in place, individual banks can drive a competitive advantage by offering that while the ISO journey is on its way for rest of the banks to adopt. Hopefully that gives you some perspective on how we are looking at this.
Here's an observation on this subject that I really appreciate, leveraging Ken's container analogy. And the containerization wave that was spawned in the 50s then was followed with the computer revolution in the 60s, and that really inspired the science of inventory management. When I think about what we are implementing with ISO, in the payments chain, distinct from the physical supply chain, mated with the revolution in AI that is looming. Given the data-rich nature of the ISO message format, the opportunity is very, very profound. And we look forward to the collaboration, the innovation of those in this room to help realize that vision. But it's not going to happen in months. It will take time to develop, but it's a very exciting horizon.
Great. I see another question on the Q&A. We are in our coexistence period still until the end of 2025. Is there anything in the short and medium term that we can realize as a benefit of ISO while local market infrastructures are still adopting?
Sorry, say that question again? I was looking at the monitor.
What short and medium term wins can we realize from ISO while still in the coexistence period?
The short-term wins is the lessons learned. Candidly speaking, lessons learned. There's not, I don't see an opportunity for us to immediately monetize any of the things that we are doing in the short term. There's lessons learned to drive the better origination of the quality of data so that we can get the Fed migration out of the way. Mm-hmm. So all of our focus is on how do you successfully get the Fed migration out of the way. One of the big things that is preached by my senior management all the way from Brian to the senior leaders within Bank of America is the necessity of the bigger banks, because we have more exposure to some of the risks that exist in the payment industry. It is our obligation to share some of these best practices on the governance aspect to the banks who are serving a smaller community need that may not have the level of diversification that bigger banks or chips or other institutions bring to the table. So we have to figure out a more effective and efficient way to leverage the industry forums such as BAFT to really help those smaller institutions gain the knowledge that they want. And we also need to make sure that any type of centralization that I was talking about, I think the previous panel, I believe Cross River was giving a value proposition of a centralized technology stack for multiple banks to use. The payment pie is very, very big. Every player can play, and all of us can make our revenue goals as well as provide the value service that we need to do for the specific client segment. So how do we transparently engage all the partners? Because there are no secrets in the payment business. Everybody knows what clearing exists. Everybody knows how to format the payment and the clearing. We become members of the clearing based on the customer needs of what our customer wants and where my future acquisition strategy is from the customer perspective is where we are going to go into the clearing. So since there are no secrets, it is very important for us to share these lessons learned with the next set of institutions to help them along the journey. After the Fed wire is done, right now you can already see with the GPI, the end-to-end tracking, end-to-end reference number that is available in the payments. Yep. There are wonderful analysis that is already available on how many hops the payment takes, is the route of the payment, is it efficient or inefficient? It's already there. So these data, coupled with the other AI topics that we talked about, is going to augment the type of intelligence we can gain to customize our product for the customer's needs. Mm-hmm. So very bullish on the long term. Short term, we all need to take it very, very seriously to avoid any type of disruptions for the Fed wire migration, because on average, you may know the numbers much better, Richard. How many trillions we process through the Fed on average a day?
About 4 trillion.
There you go. That's very important for us to get this taken care of.
Yep. And just to expand on that a little bit, and we'll take a bit of a twist, is what can we do now? What do we have to do? I think one of the things we have to change is mindset too, is the underlying eco-infrastructure we always think is competitive. It is non-competitive. The underlying infrastructure has to be the same for everyone. Otherwise, we can't actually move money around. What you build on top of that is the competitive stuff, not the underlying infrastructure itself. Look at the internet. The internet itself is not competitive. It's what you build on the internet that is competitive. So BIS came up with a paper on the Fintranet. Have a read of that. So it kind of talks a little bit about that. We also have to think less tactically and more strategically, because that question, what are the benefits in the short term? There will be none. The benefits are for the long term. Get to parity as far as the infrastructure is concerned, and then we can actually build new things for our clients, and we can actually show benefits to our clients. Until we get there, that mindset, we will never reap the benefits. Personal opinion. Oops.
All right, I think we're over time actually. So thank you all. Thanks for attending, and a round of applause for our panelists.
Thank you.